We've just had the US midterm elections. Again, very, very interesting, and it's populism in action. This is something that I think has become extremely interesting. So what I want you to do now, if you can, is tell me what's all of these people on this slide, what do they have in common? Does anyone know? Any answers? Basically, they are all what are termed populist politicians. So, of course, you have the most obvious one on there, and the most recognizable is President Trump. But if you go across all of that slide, there are politicians from the extreme left and the extreme right. You've got, for example, Erdogan in Turkey, who's an extreme politician there. You have, even in the Philippines, Duterte. You have Italian five-star leadership, the Northern League. And then you have Geert Wilders, in the Dutch politician. You have Marine Le Pen, extreme right French politician. Narendra Modi, Prime Minister of India, also a nationalist politician. And Bernie Sanders on the extreme left in the US. So you can see that populism isn't just extreme right or extreme left, it's actually both. But what we're seeing at the moment, the tide of populism, certainly seems to be shifting towards the extreme right. So you're probably asking, what's populism? What does it mean? Yes, these are all strong leaders. We hear about these people. Trump, of course, we hear about the most. Well, what is populism? A dictionary definition of populism is that it supports the concerns of ordinary people. Well, that sounds all right. That's pretty innocuous. Ordinary people. It's good to have politicians that support ordinary people. But what's happened is that a lot of politicians have hijacked the term, in a sense, to say that they are embodying this populist spirit. It's them against us. It's the people against the elite. It's these elite politicians that need to be taken away, and we need to work for the people. And these are the words of people like President Trump. If you look at that last quote on the slide, we are transferring power from Washington, D.C. and giving it back to you, the people. Well, he said this on his inauguration in November 2016. And since then, it's always been about giving power back to the people. The reason I've got a picture of Bane there, by the way, from Batman, is actually Bane kind of said a similar thing. He said, let's give power from people of Gotham to the people. But anyway, clearly, it's a very, very populist tone, and we see this. And a populist leader is essentially, it's a quintessential form of populist mobilization. These are leaders that say they act for the people in an extreme way, whether it's extreme left or extreme right. The rise of populism. Why and how did populism gain such a foothold? The reality is, actually, there was a populist party in the US in the 1880s. So populism has been around for a very, very, very long time. But only in the last few years has populism really intensified and accelerated. You could argue the election of President Trump in 2016 and Brexit are both consequences of populism. It's a disaffection with elitists, and many people see these politicians who have lost touch with the people as elitist politicians. It's a resentment of immigration. The amount of anti-immigrant rhetoric that we see nowadays, we haven't seen for years and years. Look at this caravan of immigrants coming from Central America towards and through Mexico, and ultimately trying to get into the US. And a lot of the rhetoric against this train of immigrants coming through has been really quite aggressive and used as a tactic in the midterm elections in the US to push the right-wing message in the US political spectrum. It's a resentment of immigration, and also it's income inequality. We've seen automation, technology, trade, globalization. These are things that have happened over the last several years, probably several decades. But the reality is that it's left a lot of people untouched. It may have helped some. It may have helped people get out of poverty overall. Globalization, you could argue, as an economist, does help global growth. It helps to bring the world out of poverty. But there are elements of society that have not benefited from this, and that has seen a divergence between in some cases, the rich and poor. Multiculturalism and globalism are two causes that have led to an increase in populism. The other thing that has been a particular cause in recent years is the financial crisis. In 2008, we had a massive financial crisis. It caused some banks to go under. It caused recessions in many countries. It caused market collapses across the world, and it had a significant impact on wealth. But did it hit the bankers? Did it hit the financial sector? Yes, some banks went out of business. Yes, some banks merged. But the reality was that the massive economic impact of the economic crisis and financial crisis was really on the people. And this had a huge impact in driving populism even more stronger. So the consequences have been the election of populist and even authoritarian governments and leaders across the world. And you could argue that President Trump is again an element of this. Its policies advocating trade protectionism. What we're seeing, and it's pretty important for Asia, by the way, because Asia is a trading nation. Singapore, actually 200% of Singapore's GDP, or over 200%, is trade. So it's very, very important. If you suddenly start to see restrictions to trade, barriers to trade, it has a massive impact on growth and certainly on the Asian region. Anti-globalization, again, restrictions on immigration, that's something that, again, we're seeing all over the place. And if you remember that first slide I showed you with all these populist leaders, they're just a handful of the populist leaders that have been elected globally in the last few years. I could have added several more. I could have added Podemos in Spain, a very, very left-wing party. I could have added in Austria, part of the government is a right-wing party. In Poland, very similarly. In fact, today in Poland, there was supposed to be a march of 60,000 extreme right-wing nationalists, not just from Poland, but all over the world, getting together, again, anti-immigration, anti-trade, but very, 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 very right-wing elements of society. That was actually stopped at the last minute by the mayor of Warsaw. But again, you can see that this is something that's building up across the world, not just in a few countries. It's something we have to live with in reality that's happening across the world. Again, growing resistance of societies to other races and religions and belief systems. Somewhere, again, sitting in Singapore where you have a multicultural society, it's not obvious that that's the case in the rest of the world where you're seeing such a massive shift, in particular to the extreme right. And it's been used in elections. I mentioned the midterm elections. A lot of people thought that the Republican Party, or certainly President Trump's standing, would be lowered several notches by the midterm elections. That really wasn't the case. It wasn't a blue wave of Democrats. Populist politicians actually did well in the US Senate in particular, even if the Democrats won the House of Republicans. So you can see, House of Representatives. So you can see populism is still very much alive and well and pushing even stronger. So what's the economic fallout of populism? There's definitely a sense of more nationalism, less integration in society. As I mentioned, restrictions on immigration, free movement of labor, goods and services. All of this actually hurts growth. My economic studies have shown clearly that globalization is good for growth. Trade should be good for growth. It lowers costs in countries. It reduces wages because you have free movement between countries of labor. You have, again, higher productivity because you can specialize. One country can specialize in certain goods, another country can specialize in another good, and global trade will grow. But when you close off the barriers to trade, that's not necessarily the case. You suddenly drive wages higher, which is good. You might enjoy higher wages, but it reduces productivity ultimately. It hurts companies' profits and ultimately filters down to us, the people. Trade-driven economies, as I mentioned, are particularly at risk. And again, I would say that Asia, as a region globally, is one of the most trade-driven regions globally. So, we are going to feel this as a region in the next few years. You probably hear a lot in the news about trade tariffs. This is the US administration putting tariffs against Chinese exports. they've already levied significant tariffs on China's exports. In other words, a US importer has to pay more money to import goods from China. That could even escalate even further as we go into next year. And again, this trade war is escalating. It's not improving. And again, you can see that this is another consequence of populism. Another issue is inflation, because if you are raising prices on goods that come into your country, we will feel that in our pockets. We have to pay more for goods. We have to pay more for food. We have to pay more for groceries. We have to pay more for televisions and everything else that we buy on a daily basis. So initially it looks great. You know, if I've got more money in my pocket, I have higher wages, but ultimately those wages disappear when you're paying more for goods and it costs more to produce, and it hurts the economies that we live in, and ultimately that hurts all of us. And I put on the slide, it contributes to stagflation. What's stagflation? Stagflation is actually lower growth and higher inflation. That's a very, very bad combination for economies to have that lower growth, higher inflation. It hurts us again. So ultimately, you know, all of this means short-term gain, long-term pain. As I said, we all like tax cuts. I would love to pay less taxes, but ultimately less taxes will only be a short-term boost to growth. In fact, in the US, the administration cut taxes. The US economy is flying. It's doing really well. But we're looking at an economy that ultimately, as we go into next year, might to slow down quite sharply because these tax cuts are only a one-off. They don't help from a long-term perspective unless investment picks up and productivity growth picks up. And that's something that's not been happening. Higher prices for goods result in higher import bills, wider trade and fiscal deficits. A fiscal deficit is effectively when the government is spending more than it's receiving from taxes. Again, it's not good for an economy. It's not good for our future generations, because ultimately, to pay for that deficit, you have to issue more debt. To issue more debt, you have to pay for that debt. Ultimately, you raise taxes. And it's a vicious cycle. And ultimately, generations going forward will have to pay for the higher levels of debt that are being issued. So our children and our children's children and our children's children's children will be paying more and more for this debt issuance because of these higher fiscal deficits. Financial markets, so if you buy equities, stock markets have been doing really well in the US, again, because of these tax cuts. So they do well because of that. But it's a sugar high. Once a sugar high disappears, things start to look much more negative, and then growth starts to come under more pressure. The rest, again, we talk about reduced immigration. You know, it's not surprising to hear about immigration pressures. You know, people worry about their jobs. At a time of crisis, you don't want to hear about foreign labor coming in and taking your job, right? And that's why you've had this immigration pressures. But reduced immigration ultimately means you reduce the labor force. When you have an aging population, as many countries in the world do, you need immigration. You need younger people to push up the labor force again. Otherwise, you have an increased dependency ratio. There's less people working for the amount of people who are getting older. And so those people have to either work harder and pay more tax, or people have to die more quickly. But ultimately, it's not a good thing having reduced immigration in that sense. So how does this work from a domino effect perspective? Now, those leaders that I showed at the beginning, these aren't a few, these are many. This is something that is not going to disappear. It's not a fad. Populism is something that is continuing, and it's only growing. And, you know, as I said, the midterm elections in the US, to me, didn't show an end to populism. All these elections globally aren't showing an end to populism. In fact, it's a very significant political force, and we have to live with it, because I don't think it's going to die quickly. So how do you live with populism? It could lose momentum. Now, that's interesting. How does it lose momentum? Well, if individuals are able to cope with technological change, that's helpful, because if you give people, if you empower people to help with the technological transfer, they feel less alienated. They feel less pressured. They feel less against immigrants, or they feel less against the governments who are trying to help. Inequalities can be addressed, both income and social inequalities. And again, it could be down to the government because, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that's happened is people have felt that the governments have shifted away from them, that there's been a big disassociation between governments and the people. The governments need to get closer. They need to become more accountable to their people. How do you have a billionaire president in the US who many people in the US feel that is closer to them than the average politician? It shows you have to talk like the people. You have to be like the people, and you have to connect like the people. So you have to become more accountable. You focused on policies that generate inclusive growth and rising wages. Reassessing income and tax policies are important. And finally, you've got to keep an open mind, all of us. You've got to allow people to speak their mind, and you've got to talk to people in the way that they can understand, not above people. And if you're open and you now allow free speech, you allow people to say their concerns, and that they feel that you're listening to their concerns, the need for populism, extreme politicians around the world, may no longer be necessary.